History of the World by J. M. Roberts, Book 7, The End of the Europeans' World, Chapter 6, The Shaping of a New World. After the First World War, it had still been possible to embrace the illusion that an old order might be restored. In 1945, no one in authority could believe such a thing. This was one healthy contrast between the circumstances of the two great attempts of this century to reorder international life. Neither, of course, could start with a clean sheet on which to plan. Events had closed off many roads, and crucial decisions had already been taken, some by agreement, some not, about what should follow victory. One of the most important of the Second World War had been that once more an international organization should be set up to maintain international peace. The fact that the great powers saw such an organization in different ways, the Americans as a beginning to the regulation of international life by law, and the Russians as a means of maintaining the Grand Alliance, did not prevent them pressing forward. So, the United Nations Organization, UNO, came into being at San Francisco in 1945. Much thought naturally had been given to the failure of the League of the Nations to come up to expectations. One of its defects was avoided in 1945. The United States and Russia belonged to a new organization from the start. Apart from this, the basic structure of the United Nations resembled that of the League in outline. Its two essential organs were a small council and a large assembly. Permanent representatives of all member states were to sit in the General Assembly. The Security Council had at first 11 members, of whom 5 were permanent. These were the representatives of the United States, the USSR, Great Britain, France, at the insistence of Winston Churchill, and China. The Security Council was given greater power than the old League Council, and this was largely the doing of the Russians. They believed that there was a strong likelihood that they would always be outvoted in the General Assembly, where, at first, 51 nations were represented because the United States could rely not only on the votes of its allies but also on those of its Latin American satellites. Naturally, not all the smaller powers liked this. They were uneasy about a body on which, at any one moment, any of them was likely not to have a seat, which would have the last word and in which the great powers could carry the main weight. Nevertheless, the structure the great powers wanted was adopted as, indeed, it had to be if any organization was to work at all. The other main issue, which caused grave constitutional dispute, was the veto power given to the permanent members of the Security Council. This was a necessary feature if the great powers were to accept the organization, though in the end the veto was restricted somewhat, in that a permanent member could not prevent investigation and discussion of matters which especially affected it, unless they were likely to lead to action inimical to its interests. In theory, the Security Council possessed very great powers, but of course, their operation was bound to reflect political reality. In its first decades, the importance of the United Nations proved to lie not in its power to act, but rather in the forum it provided for discussion. For the first time, a world public linked as never before by radio and film, and later by television, would have to be presented with a case made at the General Assembly for what sovereign nations did. This was something quite different. The United Nations at once gave a new dimension to international politics. It took much longer to provide effective new instrumentation for dealing with its problems. Sometimes the new publicity of international argument led to feelings of sterility, as increasingly bitter and unyielding views were set out in debates which changed no one's mind. But an educational force was at work. It was important, too, that it was soon decided that the permanent seat of the General Assembly would be in New York. This drew American attention to it and helped to offset the historic pull of isolationism. The United Nations General Assembly met for the first time, nonetheless, in London in 1946. Bitter debates began at once. Complaints were made about the continued presence of Russian soldiers in Iranian Azerbaijan occupied during the war, and the Russians promptly replied by attacking Great Britain for keeping her forces in Greece. Within a few days, the first veto was cast by the Soviet delegation. There were to be many more. The instrument which the Americans and British had regarded and continued to use as an extraordinary measure for the protection of special interests became a familiar piece of Soviet diplomatic technique. Already in 1946, the United Nations was an arena in which the USSR contended with a still inchoate Western Bloc, which its policies were to do much to solidify. Though the origins of conflict between the United States and Russia are often traced back a very long way. In the later years of the war, the British government had tended to feel that the Americans made too many concessions and were over friendly to the Soviet Union. Of course, there was always a fundamental ideological division. If the Russians had not always had a deep preconception about the roots of behavior of capitalist societies, they would certainly have behaved differently after 1945 towards their wartime ally. It is also true that some Americans never ceased to distrust Russia and saw her as a revolutionary threat. But this did not mean that they had much impact on the making of American policy. In 1945, when the war ended, American distrust of Russian intentions was much less than it later became. Of the two states, the more suspicious and wary was the Soviet Union. At that moment, there were no other true great powers left. The war had catalyzed the realization of Tocqueville's intuition a century before that between them and America and Russia would one day dominate the world. For all the legal fictions expressed in the composition of the Security Council, Great Britain was gravely overstrained. France barely risen from the living death of occupation and stricken by internal divisions. A large communist party threatened its stability, while Italy had discovered new quarrels to add to old ones. Germany was in ruins and under occupation. Japan was occupied and militarily powerless, while China had never yet been a great power in modern times. The Americans and Russians therefore enjoyed an immense superiority over all possible rivals. They were also the only real victors, in that they alone had made positive gains from the war. All the other victorious states had, at the most, one survival or resurrection. To the United States and USSR, the war brought new empires. Though the empire of the Soviet Union had been won at huge cost, it now had greater strength than it had ever known under the Tsars. Soviet armies dominated a vast European glacis, much of which was sovereign Soviet territory. The rest was organized in states which were, by 1948, in every sense satellites, and one of them was East Germany, a major industrial entity. Beyond the glacis lay Yugoslavia and Albania, the only communist states to emerge since the war without the help of Russian occupation. In 1945, both seemed assured allies of Moscow. This advantageous Soviet position had been won by the fighting of the Red Army, but it also owed much to the decisions taken by Western governments and to their commander in chief in Europe during the closing stages of the war, when he had resisted pressure to get to Prague and Berlin before the Russians. The resulting Soviet strategical predominance in Central Europe was all the more menacing because the old traditional barriers to Russian power in 1914, the Habsburg Empire and a united Germany, were no more. An exhausted Great Britain and slowly reviving France could not be expected to stand up to the Red Army, and no other conceivable counterweight on land existed if the Americans went home. Soviet armies also stood in 1945 on the borders of Turkey and Greece, where a communist rising was underway, and occupied northern Iran. In the Far East, they had held much of Xinjiang, Mongolia, Northern Korea, and the naval base of Port Arthur, as well as the occupying the rest of Manchuria, though the only territory they actually took from Japan was the southern half of the island of Sakhalin and the Kurils. The rest of their gains had been effectively at China's expense. Yet in China, there was already visible at the end of the war the outline of a new communist state, which could be expected to be friendly to Moscow. Stalin might have backed the wrong horse there in the past, but the Chinese communists could not hope for moral and material help from anyone else. So it seemed that in Asia too, a Soviet satellite might be in the making. There was no reason to think that the Soviet leadership had forgotten old Russia's ambitions to be a Pacific power. The new world power of the United States rested much less on occupation of territory than that of the USSR. It too had, at the end of the war, a garrison in the heart of Europe. But American electors in 1945 wanted it brought home as soon as possible. American naval and air bases around much of the Eurasian landmass were another matter. Although Russia was a greater Asian power than ever, the elimination of Japan's naval power, the acquisition of island airfields, and technological changes, which made huge fleet trains possible, had together turned the Pacific Ocean into an American lake. Above all, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated the power of the new weapon which the United States alone possessed, albeit in very small numbers, the atomic bomb. But the deepest roots of American empire lay in its economic strength. With the Red Army, the overwhelming industrial power of the United States had been decisive for the Allied victory, equipping not only its own huge forces but many of those of its allies. Moreover, by comparison with them, victory had costed little. American casualties were fewer. Even those of the United Kingdom were heavier, and those of Russia colossally so. The home base of the United States had been immune to enemy attack in any but a trivial sense and was undamaged. Its fixed capital was intact, its resources greater than ever. Its citizens had seen their standard of living actually rise during the war. The armament program ended a depression which had not been mastered by Roosevelt's New Deal. America was a great creditor country with capital to invest abroad in a world where no one else could supply it. Finally, its old commercial and political rivals were staggering under the troubles of recovery. Their economies drifted into the ambit of America because of their own lack of resources. The result was a worldwide surge of indirect American power, its beginnings visible even before the war ended. Something of the future implicit in the great power polarization could dimly be seen before the fighting stopped in Europe. It was made clear, for example, that the Russians would not be allowed to participate in the occupation of Italy or the dismantling of its colonial empire, and that the British and the Americans could not hope for a Polish settlement other than one wanted by Stalin. Yet, in spite of their record in their own hemisphere, the Americans were not happy about explicit spheres of influence. The Russians were readier to take them as a working basis. There is no need to read back into such divergences, assumptions which became current a few years after the war, when conflict between the two powers was presumed to have been sought from the start by one or other of them. Appearances can be deceptive. For all the power of the United States in 1945, there was little political will to use it. The first concern of the American military after victory was to achieve as rapid a demobilization as possible. Lend Lease arrangements with allies had already been cut off even before the Japanese surrender. This further reduced America's indirect international leverage. It simply weakened friends it would soon be needing, who now faced grave recovery problems. They could not provide a new security system to replace American strength, nor could the use of the atomic bombs be envisaged except in the last resort. They were too powerful. It is much harder to be sure of what was going on in Stalin's Russia. Its peoples had clearly suffered appallingly from the war, more probably than even the Germans. No one has been able to do more than provide estimates, but it seems likely that over 20 million Soviet citizens may have died. Stalin may well have been less aware of Soviet strength than the Soviet weaknesses when the war ended. True, his governmental methods relieved him of any need, such as faced Western countries, to demobilize the huge land forces which gave him supremacy on the spot in Europe. But the USSR had no atomic bomb nor a significant strategic bomber force, and Stalin's decision to develop nuclear weapons put a further grave strain on the Soviet economy at a time when general economic reconstruction was desperately needed. The years immediately after the war were to prove as grim as had been those of the industrialization race of the 1930s. Yet, in September 1949, an atomic explosion was achieved. In the following March, it was officially announced that the USSR had an atomic weapon. By then, much had changed. Piecemeal, relations between the two major world powers had by then deteriorated very badly. This was largely the result of what happened in Europe, the area most in need of imaginative and coordinated reconstruction in 1945. The cost of the war's destruction there has never been accurately measured. Leaving out the Russians, about 14 and a quarter million Europeans were dead. In the most stricken countries, those who survived lived amid ruins. One estimate is that about 7.5 million dwellings were destroyed in Germany and Russia. Factories and communications were shattered. There was nothing with which to pay for the imports Europe needed, and currencies had collapsed. Allied occupation forces found that cigarettes and bully beef were better than money. Civilized society had given way not only under the horrors of Nazi warfare, but also because occupation has transformed lying, swindling, cheating, and stealing into acts of virtue. They were not only necessary to survival, but they could be glorified as acts of resistance. The struggles against German occupying forces had bred new divisions. As countries were liberated by the advancing Allied armies, the firing squads got to work in their wake, and old scores were wiped out. It was said that in France, more perished in the purification of liberation than in the Great Terror of 1793. Above all, more finally than in 1918, the economic structure of Europe had disintegrated. The flywheel of much of European economic life had once been industrial Germany. But even if the communications and the productive capacity to restore the machine had been there, the Allies were at first bent on holding down German industrial production to prevent its recovery. Furthermore, Germany was divided. From the start, the Russians had been carrying off capital equipment as reparations to repair their own ravaged lands. As well they might. The Germans had destroyed 39,000 miles of railway track alone in their retreat in Russia. The Soviet Union may have lost a quarter of its gross capital equipment. A political division between Eastern and Western Europe was coming to be evident before the end of the war. The British, in particular, had been alarmed by what happened to Poland. It seemed to show that the Soviet Union would only tolerate governments in Eastern Europe which were subservient. This was hardly what the Americans had envisaged as freedom for Eastern Europeans to choose their own rulers. But until the war was over, neither government nor public in the United States was much concerned or much doubted they could come to a reasonable agreement with the Russians. Broadly speaking, Roosevelt had been sure that America could get on with the Soviet Union. They had common ground in resisting a revival of German power and undermining the old colonial empires. Neither he nor the American public showed any awareness of historic tendencies of Russian policy. They disapproved strongly of British forces in Greece fighting the communists, who sought to overthrow the monarchy after the German withdrawal. Stalin did not object. He had agreed with Churchill that Great Britain should have a virtually free hand in Greece in return for having won himself in Romania. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt on his death in April 1945, and his advisors came to change American policies largely as a result of their experience in Germany. The Russians were punctilious in carrying out their agreement to admit British and American and later French armed forces to Berlin and share the administration of the city they had conquered. There is every indication that they wished Germany to be governed as a unit, as envisaged by the victors at Potsdam in July 1945, for this would give them a hand in controlling the Ruhr, potentially a treasure house of reparations. Yet the German economy soon bred friction between West and East. Soviet efforts to ensure security against German recovery led to the increasingly practical separation of its zone of occupation from those of the three other occupying powers. Probably this was at first intended to provide a solid and reliable, that is, communist core for a united Germany. But it led in the end to a solution by partition to the German problem, which no one had envisaged. First, the western zones of occupation were, for economic reasons, integrated without the eastern zone. Meanwhile, Soviet occupation policy aroused increasing distrust. The entrenchment of communism in eastern Germany seemed to repeat a pattern seen elsewhere. In 1945, there had been communist majorities only in Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, and in the other East European countries, the communists only shared power in coalition governments. Nonetheless, it increasingly looked as if those governments could, in fact, do little more than behave as Russian puppets. Something like a bloc was already appearing in Eastern Europe in 1946. Stalin obviously feared any reunification of Germany except under a government he could control. Russia had too many memories of attacks from the West to trust a united Germany. It would always have a potential for aggression which a satellite could not have. This would have been true, whatever the ideological character of a Russian government. It only made it worse that a united Germany might be capitalist. Elsewhere, though, Soviet policy showed more flexibility. While anxiously organizing Eastern Germany on the Russian side of a line slowly appearing across Europe. In China, it was still officially supported the KMT. In Iran, on the other hand, there was an obvious reluctance to withdraw Soviet forces, as had been agreed. Even when they finally departed, they left behind a satellite communist republic in Azerbaijan, to be later obliterated by the Iranians, to whom by 1947 the Americans were giving military aid. In the Security Council, the Soviet veto was more and more employed to frustrate its former allies, and it was clear that the communist parties of Western Europe were manipulated in Russian interests. Yet, Stalin's calculations remained in doubt. Perhaps he was waiting, expecting, or even relying upon economic collapse in the capitalist world. There had been and still was much goodwill for the USSR among its former allies. When Winston Churchill drew attention in 1946 to the increasing division of Europe by an Iron Curtain, he by no means spoke either for all his countrymen or for his American audience. Some condemned him. Yet, although the British Labour government elected in 1945 was at first hopeful that left could speak to left, it quickly became more skeptical. British and American policy began to converge during 1946 as it became clear that the British intervention in Greece had in fact made possible free elections, and as American officials had more experience of the tendency of Soviet policy. Nor did President Truman have any prejudices in favor of the USSR to shed. The British, moreover, were by now clearly going to leave India. That counted with American official opinion. In February 1947, a communication from the British government reached Truman, which, perhaps more than any other, conceded the long resisted admission that Great Britain was no longer a world power. The British economy had been gravely damaged by the huge efforts made during the war. There was urgent need for investment at home. The first stages of decolonization, too, were expensive. One outcome was that by 1947, the British balance of payments could only be maintained if forces were withdrawn from Greece. President Truman decided at once that the United States must fill the gap. It was a momentous decision. Financial aid was to be given to Greece and Turkey to enable them to survive the pressure they were under from Russia. He deliberately drew attention to the implication. Much more than propping up two countries was involved. Although only Turkey and Greece were to receive aid, he deliberately offered the free peoples of the world American leadership to resist with American support. Attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This was a reversal of the apparent return to isolation from Europe, which the United States had seemed to pursue in 1945, and an enormous break with the historic traditions of American foreign policy. The decision to contain Soviet power, as it was called, was possibly the most important in American diplomacy since the Louisiana Purchase. It was provoked by Russian behavior and the growing fears Stalin's policy had aroused over the previous 18 months, as well as by British weakness. Ultimately, it was to lead to unrealistic assessments of the effective limits of American power, and the critics were to say, to a new American imperialism as the policy was extended outside Europe, But this could not be seen at the time.